Welcome back, everyone. And because there are some people here who weren't here yesterday, I will just say that my name is Dhammadipa. My title is Aya. I'm also known, I'm a dual lineage teacher, so I'm also known as Reverend Conan Cardenas. And I go by she and ella pronouns in my heritage language of Spanish. And I'm very happy to be here and really appreciate the warm welcome. So I'm going to offer a Dhamma reflection. And you should have your handouts with you. So you are going to need the handout that says at the top, sense, experience, insight, and equanimity. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. This weekend we're exploring the experience of our senses and perhaps the experience of joy that can come from really understanding and practicing with our sense contacts, and how to find skillful responses to the feelings that well up in us, the emotions and responses, reactions that we have to the world that we experience. And as I mentioned, we're looking at the Middle Length Discourse 137, which is Salayatana Vibhanga, means the analysis. Vibhanga is analysis, and Sala is 6. Is senses, and Yatana is like that, like a field or a domain or a realm. And so the 6, just to name them again, the 6, whatever the internal sense bases are the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And what's implied there is those physical organs or those things as fields that are receptive to certain kinds of sensation. So when we say mind as a sense organ, is it the internal, the 6th internal sense organ? It means relating to mind as something which is capable of receiving sensation, just in the same way that our eyes or our ears or our nose is capable of receiving a particular kind of sensation. And those sensations correspond to each of the different kinds. So those are what are called the external sense fields. Yeah? So the external sense fields of things that can be seen, things that can be heard, smelled, tasted, touched, and cognized or known, understood. And when that activity happens, the way that we know it is by some form of contact, when the appropriate object comes together with the appropriate organ, and there's a consciousness that can attend to that, then there is contact. And sometimes that's quite literal, right? I forget which Thai Ajahn said, you don't know anything until you run into it. And that's true in a sense of the mental field as well. That until things actually reach the knowing mind, it's as if it weren't there. And we can see simple examples of this. You might drive along the same route every day, and then one day you notice a new sign. And you say, well, how long has that been there? Did that just arrive yesterday, or has that been there for a while and I just never noticed? So there is this contact that occurs and this way in which consciousness is affected, and there's a particular flavor to that, if you will, or form of that depends on where it came from. So as I said yesterday, the taste of the flower is different than the smell of the flower, or the sight of the flower, or the thought of the flower. All of those things impact the mind slightly differently. And then we have these responses to what we experience, and that's what I really want to mostly focus on today. And so looking at the sutta, what happens is that the Buddha refers to them as the types of mental exploration or mental Bhante Sujato. So he's a monk in Australia whose translations I often use because he tends to use some fairly contemporary language. He uses mental preoccupations. You could think of it as what's on your mind, basically. What are the 18 types of things that are on your mind? And so it's looking at happiness, sadness, or equanimity, or joy, grief, and equanimity is how it's on your handout here. And they come in, there are different kinds of joy, grief, and equanimity that are arriving at each one, or that are related, you could say, to things that are happening at the sense door, different sense doors. So there are said to be 6 kinds of joy for the householder life and 6 kinds of joy for the renunciate life. So now, to be sure, to make this distinction also, I touched a little bit yesterday, and we all touched a little bit yesterday in the questions on feeling tones. In feeling tones, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about joy, grief, and equanimity. Joy, grief, and equanimity are what we would call sankharas, or mental constructions that happen on top of those very, very basic tones of the experience. So it's a little more complex phenomena, and for that reason, it also tends to be something that's up for us, that's easily visible in the mind. Much more easily visible sometimes in those very subtle tones. Yeah, it's easier to know that you're joyful, for example, than to know what was the feeling tone that sparked that joy for you. Yeah, we'll see. I might tell a story related to that. But before that, I want to go back to this division that the Buddha is making here between what is being translated as householder life and renunciate life, and or lay life and renunciate life, or monastic life is sometimes how it's also translated. And that's literally how the Buddha divides it up there. In part, I think, because of his personal experience, but we'll see why in just a minute. but also because this very high value for renunciation, for being willing to set some things down in order to find the mind that can open to a new experience of reality. So that said, what I want to do is frame it a little differently, because Buddhism is also very clear. The Buddha himself, and I argue probably all of the forms of Buddhism that I'm aware of, are very clear that lay people can wake up just as much as ordained folks. In the early Buddhism, there's some discrepancy about the arhat, that if you become a fully awakened arhat, then you have to ordain at that point because of what's important to you. But we can talk about that later. But in terms of the capacity, one's capacity for insight or awakening, it's clear that according to the early teachings, everyone has the capacity. And so this distinction that's being made here, I would like to suggest, is a distinction between a material focus in life, a materialistic or pleasure-based focus or object-based focus in life, versus a principle-focused focus on the principles that are at work in your life. The commentaries talk about it in terms of material and insight. What is it that what's described here as the renunciate view is connected with the development of insight. And so this is a very important way for us to start to relate to experience. And I want to be clear that we're not talking about rejecting the content of our experience or ignoring the content of our experience, but rather to look at the content of our experience through the lens of what are the principles that are being demonstrated in that content, right here, in this body and mind, in this world that we encounter. And the example that I like to use is the example of Sir Isaac Newton. So some of you might be familiar with Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a British man. He lived in the 7th century. He, as the story goes, an apple fell on his head, or nowadays they say it's not really clear whether it actually fell on his head or on him somewhere or near him, but in any event, the apple fell. And as a result, he, among other things, so he was the developer, he was the person who developed calculus. For all of us who really struggled with that one, no thank you, Sir Isaac Newton. I enjoy math, but not that part of it. And but he also discovered gravity and was the first person that we know of, the first human being to actually come up with a way of describing how gravity works, formulaically, mathematically, and be able to describe it to other people. And the reason and the way that happened was that when the apple fell on his head, or fell on him or near him, when the apple fell, instead of him saying, "Damn, apple fell on my head," or, "Oh, yummy apple, I'm going to eat this apple," or, "I'll give this apple to my teacher," he said, "What is it that makes the apple fall? Why is it that the apple always falls down?" So do you see? He's dealing directly with exactly the same content. It's not that he's ignoring the apple. He's actually paying a lot of attention to the apple and the falling of the apple, but in such a way that he can discern what is the mechanism that is at work there. And in the same way, we are asked in this practice that we're exploring this weekend to look at our sense experience in such a way that we can begin to discern the mechanism that is at work there. Same content, different perspective. So that is the difference that we're going to look at here. So there are 6 kinds of joy. So joy through the 6 sense fields that are related to material things. And in fact, it's interesting because the sutta says very specifically, there are sights known by the eye, and it always takes the eye first and then goes through the other 6, that are likable, agreeable, pleasing, connected with the world's material delights. And happiness arises when you regard it as a gain to obtain such sights, or when you recollect those sights that you formerly obtained. Yeah? So it's a materialist view. It's perfectly fine. This happens to everyone. We say, oh, I really would like to have that apple. And when you get the apple, you're a little bit happier about having the apple, usually. Not always, because maybe the apple didn't turn out the way you thought, but oftentimes that's how it works. And contrast that with the joy of the renunciate life. So here's the way that the Buddha is describing the joy of the renunciate, or again, the sort of principle-centered view of the sense experience. He says, when you've understood the impermanence of sights, of those contacts that are coming through the eye field, when you've understood the impermanence of sights, their perishing, their fading away, their cessation, happiness arises as you truly understand, with right understanding, that both formerly and now, all sights are impermanent, dukkha, and perishable. Yeah. So that's a very interesting proposition. Why is it that the understanding of impermanence would bring joy? And I want to suggest that it's something you could take on as a koan today. But anytime that we come to an embodied, a visceral understanding and alignment with what's true, that will bring joy. That will bring relief. Oftentimes it will bring tears, because we suddenly realize that we have relinquished a kind of resistance that we have been conducting against the reality of our lived experience. So when we realize what's happened, and we realize the reality of the lived experience, and we can accept that and embody that, then joy comes up naturally. Oh wow, what a relief that I see this now. I see that, yeah, if I get hung up on whether or not I get to have the apple, or if I get hung up on that defining me in some way, I'm a special person because I got the apple, or whatever it is that leads to that is the source of that clinging, then that is going to create a resistance to impermanence. And impermanence is true. I think that that's obvious. We can say that and intellectually assent to that. But the degree to which that's true is very hard for us to take in oftentimes. And as I often say, all things are leaving you. All things. Whether in life or in death, all things are leaving you. So impermanence is something that is inescapable. So there's this joy of being able to say, oh wow, yeah, I get it now. That to the extent that I can accept that, remember that about what's happening in my life, then I'll have more joy, I'll have more ease. I'll drop some of the difficulty, some of the pushback against reality. So again, see that it's the principle of impermanence, the attention to that principle of impermanence, which is what's bringing up this joy. Right? So then we move into the grief. the grief is very interesting because, again, it's not what you might intuit about it. So there's grief about, if you have a materialistic perspective, then there's grief about when you regard it as a loss, to lose something that you see or that you formerly were able to see, but you cannot, or hear, or touch, or taste, etc. Yes, so that happens. It reminds me of the old Zen poem. Let's see if I can paraphrase it, because I don't remember it word by word, but something like, even in Kyoto, I long for Kyoto. Yeah. This way that we feel sad about things that are different kinds of sense experience that are no longer in our lives. And then there is the grief of the renunciate life, or the grief of the principle-centered view. So what is the grief of the principle-centered view? It is, again, when you understand the impermanence of sight, and all the other types of contact, you truly understand that all sights are impermanent and perishable. And upon seeing this, you give rise to yearning for the supreme liberations. And you say, oh, when will I, this is the Shakespearean version, oh, when will I enter and remain in the same dimension that those noble ones enter and remain in today? So what is this? This is when you look at your practice and you say, I really would like to make more progress. I really would like to make more progress in my practice. And that is a source of grief, and you feel bad, or you feel frustrated, or you feel sad, or you compare yourself to other people, or you get down on even coming to practice anymore, because you're like, I'll never really be able to get this stuff or have any kind of real insight. It reminds me of dear Blanche Hartman. She was the first woman abbess of San Francisco Zen Center, and a dear teacher and friend to me. And she told me the story of when she went, during the time when she was very new to San Francisco Zen Center, she came in and she sat down, and Suzuki Roshi was giving a talk, and he was saying something about that, about, awakening to the true nature of all things. And she thought to herself, oh, he doesn't know me. Like it doesn't apply to her. And she said, then years later, as time went on, I realized, oh, it does really apply to me. And it does really apply to everybody else who was in that room and who is in this room right now. And of course, she did really realize something, because she became the abbot. So it did really apply to her, no matter what she believed about it. So this kind of grief about the path is something that the Buddha describes very clearly. And we'll talk just in just a minute about what he says to do about that. But I want to go on to the equanimity, because the Buddha very interestingly describes 3 kinds of equanimity in this sutta. He describes equanimity of the lay life, or the, again, materialist form of equanimity. And he says this kind of material view for an ordinary person who hasn't overcome their limitations of mind, I will put in parentheses there, they see a sight with the eye and they feel equanimity, but that equanimity doesn't transcend the thing seen. It doesn't transcend the sense experience. And so what the Buddha is pointing at here, I believe, is something like not caring. You see a thing or you hear a thing and you think, oh, I don't care about that. And you confuse that with a form of equanimity. So there, and what the Buddha is pointing out very clearly here is that's not actually the equanimity that is described on the path. So then he describes two other kinds of equanimity. And he describes them as, again, this sort of principle-centered view of equanimity that we all have access to, just like Sir Isaac Newton. And he says, so you've understood the impermanence of sights, and equanimity arises in you as you truly understand that impermanence. And so such equanimity transcends the sight. And so this is where, so it's a very, again, this very beautiful way of talking about how we grow, how we mature on the path. So this kind of equanimity transcends the sight, meaning what? Meaning that we can understand it, we can begin to experience impermanence in its universal sense. In its universal sense. So we know even this thing, even that thing, even so on, right? Those kinds of all. And we know it in such a way that you could say there's kind of a stepping back from the specificity. Now we step back from the content itself and are really looking at the principle only. So that is, there's a beautiful phrase for that in Pali. It's called Kayena Pusitva. Kayena Pusitva. Pusitva means having touched it, literally, having touched it. And Kayena means with the body. So having touched it with the body, which means what? It means to have a visceral experience. It means like knowing it in your bones. Knowing it in your bones. So impermanence known in such a way that it goes completely even beyond the object itself. So the example that I want to give about that is a story of being in Japan. So I was training at Hoshinji Monastery at my root master's monastery there in a little town called Obama, Japan, just outside of Kyoto. And it was the summertime, and it's like Washington, D.C. summer. It's very, very hot and very, very humid and very sunny all the time. And some of the monks had gone off to a meeting at Eheji, and they had to come back and report to everybody. But the translator was away for some reason. I don't remember why Shodo-san was away, but he was away. So I was going to have to go to the meeting and not understand a word, basically, because my Japanese is terrible, terrible. But okay, we're going to this meeting, and they handed us all out a fan. Give everybody a fan. There's a little fan, like an oval-shaped thing with blue paper fan with like some random dots on it and a little white plastic handle. And so I put the fan on my desk so I would remember to take it with me to the meeting. So when I went to go pick up the fan to go to the meeting, I looked at it again and I realized, oh, those little supposedly random dots are the constellations. These are the stars in the sky. And I thought, oh, how ironic is that? That instead of going and sitting outdoors in a nice, comfortable evening breeze, we're going to sit and fan ourselves with the concept of night sky. So human. We do that all the time. So, okay, so we go and we cram ourselves all into this little room that's off the side of the kitchen with these big fluorescent lights making things even hotter. And I'm just sitting there melting. And it's like, you know, in the Peanuts cartoon, I don't know if some of you watched these old movies that were made out of the Snoopy cartoons. And the teacher stands at the front of me and just goes, wah, 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 wah. It was just like that. It's like that. The monks were sitting there at the front of me. And I couldn't pay attention at all because I didn't understand anything that was being said. And so my friend, Ryudo-san, this very merry former farmer who is now a monk, was sitting next to me, and he had his fan with him too. So I wasn't even fanning myself at that point. I had given up on the fan, but he was fanning himself. And at one point, he flipped the fan and the whole thing went white. Like in such a way that it completely startled me. Like, and the whole fan went white. So no more fan, no more blue sky, no more constellations, none of that. In just an instant, all that was wiped out. And then flick, it comes back. The concept of night sky, the concept of fan, Ryudo-san, and then flick, again, wiped out, white, going beyond. And then flick again and it's back. And in that moment I thought, yes, I see it now. I see it. This is what we mean when we say that the Dhamma is showing you something that is inherent in your experience that you haven't yet seen. There wasn't anything special there. The light, the fan, the way that Ryudo-san was fanning himself, or the way that I was looking at the fan, none of that. And yet there was this quality of luminosity that just became completely clear and went beyond all the concepts of it. So this is the way in which the impermanence can be known in such a way that it goes beyond the content. And it's not here where he goes into the two kinds of principle-based equanimity. So I'm going to keep going a little bit. But what I want to say first is, then he says, he makes this very, very simple and perhaps easily overlooked statement. He says, relying on this, give up that. Or as you have on your handout, depending on this, abandon that. And I want to point this out as the Buddha's great compassion, as the great compassion of Buddhism in general. We're not asked to let things go without a support. You're not asked to rip the thing out of your hand. We're given the supports with which we can progress, with which we can move, with which we can practice with what is right here. And we rely on those supports, and using those supports, then we see, and insight comes. So we don't do it without the supports. Don't try it. It's not healthy. It's not helpful. It's a good way to get frustrated. So remember that also when there's something that feels like a block. What's the support for that? What's the support for moving beyond that? I think about Dogen saying, he used to like to talk about kapatsupachi. Kapatsupachi is the sound that the fish makes when the fish jumps out of the water. So the fish uses the water to exit the water. And in the same way, we use our study and our words and our bodies and our things to go beyond that and understand the principles of all reality. We make that leap. Make that leap. But with the supports. So that's the way he starts to talk about how to relate to these different types of experience. So now he's laid out all the different types of experience and what's the kind of way that we see them arising, some of the mechanism that's there. And then he talks about, and you have it there on your handout. So you take one and you use that to rely on the other. So you use the joy of the principle-centered view in order to surmount, in order to really move beyond the difficulties that are associated with the joy of the materialist view. So again, let's go back to what does that mean? It means that you use that knowing about impermanence as a way to attend to the joy that you have, and know that no state is permanent in your life. Even the joys in your life are not going to be permanent. So you keep working with that, and you keep reminding yourself that perhaps that expectation of permanence tends to creep in. But that's where you will start to feel the grief. And so he talks about surmounting the grief. So first of all, he said, if you want joy, that joy doesn't come from, that lasting joy doesn't come from material acquisitions, but what does it come from? It comes from our practice. It comes from our practice and the understanding and wisdom that develops in our practice. And that is a beautiful thing, because what it also says is that joy is accessible right here, right now, no matter what. It's a high bar, but it's saying no matter what your external circumstances are, no matter what your physical circumstances are, that through your practice you have access to joy. Meditative joy, the joy of insight. I promise you that the joy of insight will blow your head off. So you have access to that through your practice. Not relying on the outside world to give you the stuff that you want in order to have joy. That's what that first line means. Not that you can't have the things that you need. Those are also, we don't take it all the way to the other side, right? Extreme asceticism or these kinds of ideas of like criticizing yourself because, you need to have or you want to have some material thing. That's also not that super helpful. That's also more dukkha. But then he talks about the grief. And this for me is also, again, one of the most compassionate teachings. This is why I really love to share this sutta with people. So he says, surmount the grief of the materialist view by depending on the grief of the principle-centered view. And that's a kind of funny statement. Like, what do you mean depending on grief? Why would I rely on grief or on sadness? Right? But again, what is that sadness of the materialist view? That sadness of the materialist view is saying, oh, I really wishing for, hopeful about my practice bringing that wisdom and compassion that I really aspire to, that I'm inspired to look for, to try to embody. So he's saying that don't let go of that, actually. So this idea that, you should just let go of all your goals and all that good stuff, I would say Nibbana is a transcending of all goals. You can see that in the Heart Sutra, you can see that in the early Pali Suttas. But up until that point, goals are a good thing. Goals are a good thing. So this when you feel that feeling, the Buddha is saying, let that motivate you. When you feel that feeling like, oh gosh, I'd really, really like to see my practice blossom, then let that be a motivator. Let that bring you back to the cushion. Mm-hmm. Don't give up on yourself by trying to get rid of that particular kind of grief. And then the equanimity. So we have this beautiful statement about equanimity. So we have the joy of, we have one more. I don't want to skip over too much here. So yes, so we surmount or go beyond the equanimity of the materialist view. So again, what was that? That's really basically like not caring. It's not true equanimity. Yeah, it's actually, you could say, a subtle form of aversion that's being misunderstood as equanimity. Go beyond that by depending on the equanimity of the principle-centered view. So this is also another maturing that happens in practice. So there can be many very profound, very startling, or very subtle also experiences, everyday experiences of impermanence. And you can begin to understand impermanence and start to live with it in a different way. But there is oftentimes a process by which the impermanence is known in a really profound way, in a very universal kind of way, but it hasn't quite developed the equanimity with that. So there's some agitation about it, actually. This is a very, something that I see often as a phase in people's practice, where there's some understanding, and that understanding, rather than bringing peace, is bringing a kind of uncertainty or a kind of agitation or a kind of like feeling off balance yet, because you haven't quite come to a deeper knowing of it. And that's just it's just a little bit of a, like growing pains. It's something that people usually go through just by, continuing to observe the impermanence. And then there can be this very, very deep equanimity with impermanence. A place where I saw that often was in hospice care. In hospice care, so I was a hospice chaplain for some short period of time, and myself and my fellow chaplains and a lot of the people on the care team also had definitely come to a very, very deep and still compassionate way of being able to face the ultimate impermanence of people that were very dear to them. Sometimes be present with that in a way that had deep equanimity. So it can deepen to the point of that the knowing of impermanence brings this kind of ability to what? So when we talk about equanimity, oftentimes, and this is where we're going to look at the two kinds. So there's equanimity with diversity. And equanimity with diversity means you can attend to each individual thing as it is, and you can just in a way you could say is a form of acceptance. There's acceptance, like, right, it's like this right now, it's like this right now, it's like this right now, it's like this right now. That's equanimity in diversity, right? We meet it, not catch and release, because there's no catching necessary. Just meet it, and if there's a response necessary, then you can. That's great. But the equanimity is what's able to do the acceptance side of that. And then there is equanimity in unity. So equanimity in unity is, again, this way where this deep insight into the universal aspects of the experience. And the way that there were some very specific ways that tools that we have been given to experience that. And they're known as the formless perceptions. So this is a series of meditations. It's described in a lot of detail in Middle Length Discourse 121, the shorter discourse on emptiness. And the Buddha goes through a series of guidance for different types of meditations in which we can see, for example, we have the perception of boundless space. And it's interesting to see how science catches up with these things, right? So now we know, for example, one of the folks on the board at the monastery where I lived previously was a science teacher. And he'd say, right, if we look at the size of the particles in any given atom, the difference between the space between one particle and the next particle is like the equivalent of a football field. Like you put one football at one end of the football field and one football at the other end of the football field. And that's the amount of space that's in there, you know? So you think about your whole body is like that. Everything you see is like that. So there's this meditation in which we can develop the perception of boundless space. And they're called the formless perceptions for a reason. Then it goes on to boundless consciousness, to the perception of the nothingness, if you will, or the like it's usually described as something like the absence of form altogether and the absence of the consciousness altogether. And then you sort of move into there is some consciousness still there, because the next one that you move into is the neither perception nor non-perception. But it's ways of experiencing the very vast mind, very, very vast mind. Literally limitless mind. And the other form of tools, the other set of tools that we've been given to experience that same kind of vastness of the mind, which is actually very pleasant and very bright, and the Buddha described as 16 times more powerful than any other thing that would shift your karmic dial, besides the perception of impermanence. So permanent perception of impermanence is most, but metta is the second one. So the loving kindness meditation and the other three Brahmaviharas, heavenly dwellings, are these kinds of meditations that the tools that we are given to experience the mind that can see unity, a vast, vast unity. And I'm going to talk quite a bit more about the equanimity tomorrow, but I just want to drop a little bit of a check-in here for this last statement that he makes before he goes on to give some examples. And we won't go through the examples in this retreat. But he speaks about going even beyond equanimity. Going even beyond equanimity. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow, but what I want to return to is that all of this way of speaking about insight and wisdom, about our experience, is based on this shift. The shift of looking at the principles that are present within the experiences that we have. And if we attend to our lives through that lens, with that view, just like a scientist, we will discover something. We will discover something that is already there, but that we don't yet know. And in the meantime, we have this beautiful, beautiful invitation to joy through the practice. Thank you. Beautiful. So it's time for our meal reflection. And again, I think that what I'd like to do is to maybe bring the chant cards for the meal in, Charlie, if you would, and we'll do the chanting here for the meal so that the folks online can also participate. Sorry. Oh,